Hello and welcome to today's show. Up first, kind of an announcement here that Alaska Weather Show will air late on KTOO 360 North, and that will occur. The show will air after coverage of the Alaska State Legislature, so a later showing for the show tomorrow on April 13th. Otherwise, moving on to the hazardous weather graphic, we got winter weather advisories out for the northern Kuskokwim Valley, McGrath, Nikolai area, on up into Tanana, along the Alaska Range, and into the Fairbanks area, and on up into the Yukon Flats around Fort Yukon, Beaver, Chuck-Yitzhak, and those areas. That's for several inches of snow, and those advisories are out tonight into tomorrow morning, and the snow will be ending from west to east, so it'll be ending sooner here over these western zones, a little later off to the east. And satellite imagery showing a front moving into the southwest coast. The main push here into the south of the panhandle. So this is kind of rotating, broadsiding the panhandle there today with increasing rain and snow and some moisture here. Actually, an Arctic front right through here with the very cold temperatures back to the west and northwest of that feature, and areas of snow here along that, as you can see right through here, kind of enhancing. That's supporting those snow advisories we had out, or we just looked at here from the northern Kuskokwim Valley up across the central interior, Fairbanks into the Yukon Flats. Otherwise, clear and colder temperatures back here to the west with northerly winds, and about the same thing through the Bering Strait. Otherwise, down here to the south, rain and snow at times over the Pribilof Islands, and scattered rain and snow showers over the Aleutians, really scattering out, though, out to the west, rolling this through again. You can see kind of a big area of low pressure out here over the southern Bering Sea, and of course the cold air to the north of that and the milder air down here to the south, and that'll be on the chart here. That shows up looking something like this, with one low center here over the southern Bering Sea, another low center west of Bristol Bay, and the westerly flow to the south of that feature. A couple of troughs there enhancing the shower activity, one over the Alaska Peninsula, another one here over the central Aleutians. Then the showers kind of scatter out towards Shimei and Attu, and then north of the front, the colder air here coming down toward the Pribilofs today. And so mostly snow north of the front in toward Bristol Bay, and areas of snow and snow showers here over the eastern and southeast part of the state today, although some clearing down over Cook Inlet and south central Alaska areas. And then this front approaching the southeast coast, bringing increasing rain and snow and precipitation over the panhandle today. But wind's not all that big of a factor. In fact, pretty light winds up here over the west and northwest part of the state, north slope in the Arctic coast, and really not too windy even out over the Bering Sea. But for tonight, that front slowly moves into the panhandle. So look for periods of rain and snow, or rain and snow mixed here, depending on your elevation and latitude, across all the southeast coast, and areas of light rain and snow for the eastern North Gulf Coast, and that Arctic front sagging southeastward. So a chance of snow showers continues for south central Alaska tonight, but a better chance over the Copper River Basin, up across the Alaska Range, and all the way up to actually Barter Island, Kaktovik area. You'll see some chances of snow showers, but the heavier precipitation will be from the Brooks Range southward, and then drying out here to the west, and colder in the clear areas here. In fact, it'll be just colder period back to the west and northwest. And that cold air starting to push southward here into the southern Bering Sea areas. That Arctic front now just passing the Pribilof. As soon as that happens, snowfall levels will crash down to sea level, and all your precipitation will be in the form of snow. Otherwise, to the south, west-northwest winds and flow there, not too strong. We'll keep it showery over the central and eastern Aleutians, drying out a little bit. High pressure trying to develop there over the western Bering Sea out of another system out over Kamchatka Peninsula. We'll see tomorrow the edge of that system comes eastward here into they'll spread moisture into the Komodorsky Islands. High pressure building over the western Bering and the Aleutians. So look for some clearing and light winds out in that area. Otherwise, scattered rain and snow showers here for the central Aleutians. Scattered snow showers for the eastern Aleutians, and along the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula. Pacific side may see some clearing like Sand Point, Chignik, and those areas. Scattered snow showers into Kodiak. Winds now from north to south here and starting to increase. Not too strong tomorrow, but say 15 to 25 miles an hour, maybe some gusts 35 miles an hour along the coast. That same pattern up through the Bering Strait as well. And also tightening gradient along the Brooks Range, so that supports increasing northeast winds through the passes of the mountains up there, with periods of snow falling from the eastern Brooks Range, North Slope, Upper Yukon Valley down into the Kobuk and Koyukuk Valley areas. They're starting to dry out towards Selawik, though, and periods of snow at this trough over the Copper River Basin. Otherwise, scattered snow showers, mostly cloudy skies, south central Alaska, especially in the Matanuska Valley. Less of a chance in the Susitna Valley. Still a chance of snow showers Kodiak Island, and that front weakening into a trough, but continued westerly flow with that low center up over the Yukon. That'll keep a chance of rain and snow showers over the Panhandle. And then from there, moving on to the outlook for Friday, you can see this low center here, that's going to track northeastward to this position and deepen, and that's going to spread wind and rain into the southern southeast coast during the day on Friday, especially in the afternoon hours, spreading slowly northward. Northern part from about Juneau on up to Skagway, Haines, Lincoln Glacier Bay, Elfin Cove, Yakutat, looking pretty good for the day on Friday. Just some clouds, dry conditions, winds on the light side. Gradient continues to tighten here, especially over the western Brooks Range now, so northeast winds getting gusty through the passes there, and a tighter gradient here. That supports winds here from the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, and the Bering Strait area, maybe 20 to 35 miles an hour sustained, possible gusts 40 to 50 miles an hour. Otherwise, increasing winds, but not to that extent. But the cold air coming southward here continues, but should clear out over the Pueblos. Much drier conditions coming down around the big high pressure over the one center here over the Russian Far East and other centers south of the central Aleutians, and then a weak front pushing some moisture into Shimeonat. Really not a very strong system at all, with this area high pressure kind of holding it back to the west. So Adak and Atka looking pretty good through the period. Otherwise, dry for the Arctic coast, maybe some clearing periods there with lighter winds, the tighter gradient, as I mentioned, down over the Brooks Range with the gusty northeast winds through the passes, Anatuvik Pass, Howard Pass, those areas there. And kind of an unsettled pattern here for the Gulf of Alaska, and again along this trough that's going to keep rain and snow showers, or probably snow showers, in over south central Alaska as that colder air comes in from the west and northwest, just kind of seeping in for some modified Arctic air getting west and south of the Alaska range. Otherwise, for lows tonight in the 30s for the Panhandle, teens over the inland areas, and McGrath-Nikolai 5 to 10 below. In the teens to lower 20s for Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, lows in the lower to mid 30s there, otherwise 20s over the Kenai Peninsula. And for the highs tomorrow, in the 30s, mid to upper here for south central Alaska, as well as Copper River Basin, near 40 along the northwest coast, Kodiak Island, and upper 30s to lower 40s for the Panhandle. 20 to 25 west of the Alaska Range, and upper 20s and near 30 for Bristol Bay. And for the lows following morning, back down into the mid-teens here in the Susitna Valley, with lower to mid-20s for the Kenai Peninsula, Cook Inlet, near 30 Kodiak Island. Right around 10 degrees here for Bristol Bay. Single numbers up in the Kuskokwim Valley, and lows in the 30s again for the Panhandle, followed by highs 40s here for the southeast coast to about Yakutat. Upper 30s Kodiak Island, a little cooler air coming in from the northwest there, and then highs in the lower to mid 20s for Bristol Bay and in the Kuskokwim Valley as well, but highs here south central Alaska 30s to near 40 and near 41 say for Valdez, and a milder 42 in Gulkana. That'll be up to the north there. Lows mostly below zero tonight, continuing very cold here. Again, teens and 20s below zero. And same thing for the Arctic coast. Fairbanks right around 3 for the low, I believe, and then 14 below there to the west, especially for Bettles and the Tuvik Pass near 20 below. Highs tomorrow, 20s to near 30, warmer over toward the eastern border there, and 0-degree isotherm right along the Brooks Range there, up to the north, highs near 0, 5 to 10 out to the west, and then lows a little colder now, 0 to 5 for the eastern interior, otherwise 15 to 25 below up over the North Slope and Arctic coast, and 0 to 10 below here for the Norton Sound area, Seward Peninsula into the interior. That'll be followed by highs 30 to 35 over the eastern interior, and north of the Brooks Range, anywhere from 5 below to 5 above, and 5 to 10 above for the Seward Peninsula. And for the southwest coast or Pribilofs tonight, lows dropping down into the upper teens as that Arctic front sags southward, otherwise 30s for the Aleutian.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather Wednesday morning, we've got IFR here. That front moving into the southeast coast there, mostly over toward the eastern border there, Lynn Canal Glacier Bay, followed by an area of marginal VFR into the Gulf of Alaska, breaking out to VFR in the morning, actually, Thursday morning, VFR, South Central Alaska, up to the Alaska Range, some IFR there up over the eastern interior. Good VFR out here to the west, and some IFR lingering there over eastern Bristol Bay on the north side of the Alaska Peninsula. Marginal VFR for much of the Bering Sea and the Aleutians, as well as the North Slope and Arctic coast. For the afternoon, marginal VFR, eastern interior. VFR back to the west here, all the way down now to the Alaska Peninsula into the Chukchi Sea. Marginal VFR right to the west of the Pribilof Islands. Otherwise, the remainder of the Bering Sea and Aleutians in the marginal VFR zone. And now just marginal VFR for the southeast coast, Gulf of Alaska, on up into the eastern interior. And then for the Friday morning outlook, we're seeing some IFR here over the extreme northern panhandle, mostly Lynn Canal Glacier Bay areas up to Haines to the passes, and then marginal VFR to the south. IFR, northeast Prince William Sound, with areas of marginal VFR over the interior, areas of VFR as well over the interior, especially Kodiak Island up into Cook Inlet and the Sitna Valley, and into the Kuskokwim Valley as well, Bristol Bay, northern Bering Sea, VFR, Seward Peninsula. Area of IFR there for the North Slope for Friday morning. And then some building IFR out to the west, shimmying at 2, otherwise marginal VFR for the Aleutians, Bering Sea, most of the Alaska Peninsula. And for Friday afternoon, Kodiak, looks like a VFR day there, the entire day for Kodiak Island. Some of that up in toward Dillingham, King Salmon, Togiak Bay area, and the northern Bering Sea staying VFR right on up into the Chukchi Sea. And northern half of the state looking pretty good with good VFR flying that extends down into the Sitna Valley, Copper River Basin areas. Some marginal VFR there for the afternoon over the eastern North Slope, and then also the southern 3/4 of the Panhandle or so, looking pretty marginal there. And IFR now advancing eastward here to about Amchitka Island, otherwise marginal VFR for the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. Passes for Thursday. Tuvik, marginal VFR, pretty marginal for Adigan as well. And for Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR flying there. And also VFR for rainy, but lower conditions expected for windy there. Occasionally marginal. And for Isabel, same forecast, marginal VFR. And for Mentasta, marginal VFR as well. And for Tanita, looking marginal. Could be maybe some IFR thrown in there at times tomorrow, but basically marginal VFR throughout the entire day. And Portage, marginal VFR, trending toward IFR throughout the daytime, especially into the afternoon. Some more moisture kind of comes up from the southeast. And for Chilcoot and White, IFR. For the freezing levels at the surface here south of Nunivak Island and right along the north coast of Bristol Bay, up in across the North Gulf Coast and mostly north and east of the southeast coast, 2,000 feet, not reaching anywhere in Alaska. So moving on to icing, could be elevated icing potential here over the Yukon area back into the Koyukuk Valley, upper Yukon Valley, Yukon Flats areas, and same thing here in North Gulf Coast. Better chance of seeing some isolated moderate rime icing for the southeast coast there. Otherwise, nothing significant anywhere else. And looking at the jet stream here, main jet well to the south here of the mainland area is the Panhandle. Out here to the west, though, we've got north-northwesterlies coming across the western Bering Sea, down across Atka Island up to 100 knots, and moving on to 9,000 feet. Upper level low here over the western interior. To the north of that, east turning northeast flow at about 40 knots, otherwise lighter northwesterlies up to maybe 40 to 45 knots here over the central Aleutians, and to the west. Not too bad for the Panhandle at 9,000 feet as well as 3,000 feet. Pretty light variable winds in the interior here down along the southeast coast. Northeast winds turn northerly here across the eastern Bering Sea with cold upper low pressure here over the southeast interior. Higher pressure out here to the west, and then there's that next system out there with the stronger winds. And then for turbulence, occasional moderate chop here for the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian.
We have a big solar flare coming in, so we're out here on an aurora hunt. It's a CME, it's dynamite, coronal mass ejection. It's when the sun, it kicks off energy and these explosions that are larger than the Earth, explosion type things coming off of sunspots. And if that energy is pointing straight at the Earth, it gets caught up in our magnetic field, and that energy, electrons, come down our magnetic field, collide with oxygen up there about 50 or a couple hundred miles high, and that's what generates the northern lights. My job as the photographer and the aurora hunter is to be in position, you know, location, location, location. And I like to think I'm composing. Mother Nature, it's a bit of a teamwork thing, you know, she's got to put on the show, but I have to be in the right position and, of course, with the right tools and the know-how. I've stopped keeping track of how much time I spend out here in terms of hours. It's more in terms of weeks or months, or at this point, years now. You know, it was always in me. Even when I was a kid growing up in the lower 48, I would spend nights sleeping on our trampoline, just staring at the stars. I'm in 4th grade and I'm going, wow, look at those stars. And I'd see how many nights in a row I could sleep on the trampoline. And I think my record was 23 nights in a row. So I was doing kind of strange things for an Iowa country boy. I can remember specifically the very first time I saw the Northern Lights. It was 1989, the peak of the solar cycle, and I was going to graduate school in Laramie, Wyoming. And all of a sudden we had heard the Northern Lights were out. It's like, what are those? I'd never really seen them before. And my goodness gracious, we were on top of a mountain in the Laramie Range and they were turning blood red. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And the very first picture I took, that was 1990. Now, an old film camera, Pentax K1000 on a plastic Kmart tripod. Took 2 shots on slide film and got them back. And I thought, oh my gosh, this beautiful green thing swirling about. And from that moment, I was hooked. When I realized that you could preserve the auroras on film, I just experimented a ton. I'd had a heaping stack of slides, the no good ones, the experiments gone wrong, you know, too dark, fuzzy, out of focus, too light. I had this huge garbage can full of excess slide film, and that was just the learning curve. Well, when I go out here, it's all about getting the shot. And my wife and I, we've called it the hero shot. But the hero shot is the one where you just come home and you go, look at this. And everyone goes, wow, and you feel like a hero. It's a wonderful feeling. You know, it's good for the ego, of course. It's good for the business. But if you kind of strip that away, it's good for what's inside of you, because that's really the hero moment in nature. And Mother Nature's putting on this show that is just mind-blowing. It's unbelievable. When I first resigned from my day job, that was in 1996, and decided I wanted to become a full-time aurora hunter, my goal from that moment and to this day still is to get one hero shot a year. I figured, and I'm talking the kind that somebody wants to buy from you and hang on their wall, where the auroras are extremely bright, very active, turning colors, where you can't believe your eyes. If you're going to preserve a little sample of that with a photograph, well, it's what we call the hero shot. Wow, what a feeling. I mean, you're elevated, levitating, you are lifted up, your spirits are so high that I love that feeling. And I think I get that so much from seeing cool things in nature that I will go way out of my way to find that. And I can, the next day, well, I'll be just laying there thinking about it and thinking how lucky I was, or how fortunate. Of course, I just spent 2 weeks sitting there staring at the sky and not seeing anything. So you got to remember that luck is kind of a relative term. But I still just feel incredibly lucky to be even in a position to where I could have been there, taken a photograph of it, and just mainly experienced it. That feeling could last for days.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Coastal weather forecast here for the south coast, west winds 10 to 15 knots, and for the north coast, west-southwest 10 to 20 knots. Lynn Canal, south winds 20 knots, gusts 35 knots, south at about 20 for Clarence Strait. Light west winds at 10 knots for Clarence Strait. Stevens Passage, south winds at 20 knots, Clarence Strait west at 10. And then for the day on Thursday, Clarence Strait, southeast winds increasing to 30 knots, seas building to 9 feet. Otherwise, Stevens Passage, northeast at about 15. And Lynn Canal, north winds at 20 knots. Gale warnings on the south coast here as that next front approaches from the southwest, especially in the afternoon, coming up from the east-southeast, 35 to 40 knots, seas building to 10 feet. And for the central north coast, east to northeast winds, 20 to 25 knots. Prince William Sound, light variable winds at 10 knots for the day on Thursday with just 2-foot seas. Light variable winds at 10 knots here also for the North Gulf Coast, seas 5 to 6 feet. North winds 15 knots for the Barren Islands. And for Kamishak Bay, variable winds at 20 knots. And for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 5 foot seas. And for Friday, Cook Inlet, north winds 15 to 20 knots, and northwest winds 30 knots here for the Kamishak Bay zone into the Barren Islands with 10-foot seas there. And for the western North Gulf Coast, northeast winds at 20 knots, and east-northeast 25-knot winds for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, northeast winds now up to 25 knots. It's good for small craft advisories for Friday. And for Kodiak Island, southwest winds 15 to 20 knots tomorrow. Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, seas 4 to 6 feet. And moving on to Friday, Some gale warnings here on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, up to 35 knots, actually from Cape Sarachev all the way up to Sitkinak Island there, just south of Akiak. And northwest winds 30 knots, so the Bering Sea side of the peninsula with seas up to 10 feet. Bristol Bay, small craft advisories, northwest winds 25 knots. Small craft advisories, Kodiak Island, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Central eastern Aleutians tomorrow, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. And then for the western Aleutians, anywhere from north to northwest winds 15 to 20 knots. And for the day on Friday, look for those winds to swing around to the south and pick up to 25 knots, mostly west of Kiska. And for the central Aleutians here, west-southwest winds at 20 knots. And small craft advisories for the Fox Islands northwesterlies, 25 to 30 knots. And for the southwest coast, north winds 20 to 25 knots for the day Thursday, and north winds 20 knots for both St. Matthew and the Pribilof Islands with seas up to 7 feet. St. Lawrence Island, same thing, north winds 20 knots, northwest at 15 for Norton Sound. And for Friday, brisk wind advisory, St. Lawrence Island and the southwest coast, north to northwest winds at 25 knots. Small craft advisories for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island, north winds at 25 knots. And for the eastern Arctic coast, tomorrow, west winds 15 to 20 knots, light northerlies at 10 knots for the central and western Arctic coast. For the Chukchi Sea, north winds 20 to 25 knots. And taking a look at Friday up that way, we've got gale warnings here from Wales on up to Cape Thompson there for north winds at 35 knots. Otherwise, brisk wind advisories, Cape Thompson to Cape Beaufort for 25-knot north winds. Central and western Arctic coast, north 10 to 15, and light northerly winds at about 10 knots for the eastern Arctic coast. And looking at tonight's forecast again, front moving into the Panhandle slowly, the weak low there to the north of, over the northern Panhandle there. So periods of rain and snow there tonight, kind of same pattern over the North Gulf Coast, but heavier precipitation in the Panhandle in here. Areas of snow advisories continue from the northern Kuskokwim Valley across the Fairbanks area on up into the Yukon Flats as well as the Alaska Range for several inches of snow tonight. And then some snow with this weak system over Bristol Bay drying out. Colder temperatures are staying cold here over the western and northern interior. Showers for the Aleutians, and tomorrow drying out over the western Aleutians, and colder air coming southward now put the snowfall level eventually down to sea level for the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. Periods of snow eastern half of the state, drier with some sun in the west. Still unsettled for the Panhandle and the North Gulf Coast. And for the next day, less snow over the interior, mainly over the mountainous terrain, but very light now, increasing.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.